There is a story that almost everyone knows and almost everyone has wrong. It goes like this. Julius Caesar arrived in Alexandria. Fire broke out. The most celebrated library of the ancient world burned to the ground in a single night, and centuries of human knowledge vanished in the flames. Gone forever. An irreplaceable catastrophe that set civilization back by 1,000 years. It is a story with everything a tragedy requires. A villain, a moment of destruction, and irreversible loss. And it has the additional advantage of being the kind of story that makes the present feel like a recovery from something rather than a continuation of it. The only problem is that it's wrong. Not approximately wrong, not wrong in its details while correct in its essentials, but wrong in the way that matters most. Wrong about what burned, wrong about when it happened, wrong about who did it, and wrong, most importantly, about what was actually lost. The Library of Alexandria did not die in Caesar's fire. It died the way every important thing dies, slowly, collectively, through the accumulation of small failures and large indifferences over 600 years, while everyone looked the other way. Before we go further, if this is the kind of story you come here for at night, subscribing to the channel means the next one will be waiting for you when you are ready. There is no better company at this hour than history. Now, let us begin. It is the hour before sunrise in Alexandria in the 2nd century before the Common Era, and the city smells of salt water and papyrus and the particular dry heat that rolls in off the desert and meets the Mediterranean at this narrow strip of coast. The harbor is already beginning to stir. The first fishing boats moving out past the lighthouse on the island of Pharos, whose beam has been sweeping the darkness since before anyone currently alive can remember. Along the waterfront, past the royal quarter with its colonnades and its gardens, a building that is not quite like any other building in the known world is waiting for the day to begin. The building has no single entrance that announces it, no grand gate through which the whole institution can be summarized in a glance. It is more like a complex, a collection of colonnaded walkways and reading rooms, and storerooms opening onto one another, connected to the larger compound of the Mouseion, the research community that surrounds it, with its shared dining hall and its shaded peristyle, where scholars walk and argue in the mornings, when the air is still cool enough for thinking. At this hour, the rooms are empty, the scroll cases latched, the long wooden tables bare, the bronze lamps unlit. But the scrolls are there, stacked in their cases against the walls, hundreds of thousands of them, each one wrapped in linen and labeled with a tag that records the title and the author, and sometimes a brief note about the copy's quality or the circumstances of its acquisition. Some of those scrolls came willingly, purchased from booksellers in Athens and Antioch and Rhodes, at prices that reflected the library's reputation for paying what was asked without complaint. Others came differently. There is a story, repeated by several ancient sources with a matter-of-fact quality, that suggests it was common knowledge rather than scandal, that every ship arriving in the harbor of Alexandria was boarded by royal agents who searched the cargo for books. When books were found, they were taken ashore to be copied, and the copies were returned to the ship's owners, along with payment for the inconvenience, while the originals remained in Alexandria, quietly reclassified under a category called books from the ships. It was a form of acquisition that the library's administrators would not have described as theft, and that the ship's owners, receiving fair compensation and facing no legal remedy, could not quite describe as theft either, though the feeling of having been managed rather than traded with was presumably difficult to avoid. The city in which this library stands is itself a kind of argument, Alexandria was not an ancient city in the way that Memphis or Thebes or Heliopolis were ancient. Cities that had accumulated their significance across millennia of continuous habitation, layer upon layer of human life pressing down into the earth until the city became something almost geological, something that felt as permanent as the land it stood on. Alexandria was designed. It was planned on a grid by architects in the service of a conqueror who was not yet 25 years old. Built on the narrow strip of Egyptian coast between the Mediterranean and the brackish shallows of Lake Merotis, at a point where the geography offered everything a great commercial and imperial city required: deep water for large ships, proximity to the Nile's western branches, and therefore to the whole of the Egyptian agricultural hinterland, and the natural protection of a coastline complex enough to be defensible without being inaccessible. Alexander the Great laid out its boundaries in 331 BCE, roughly 3 centuries before the birth of Rome's empire. At the same moment, the Han dynasty was beginning to consolidate its hold on China, at a point in the world's history when the Mediterranean basin was reorganizing itself around the consequences of one man's extraordinary and brief career of conquest. Alexander was dead within 8 years of founding the city. His generals divided the empire he had built, and Egypt fell to a Macedonian soldier named Ptolemy, who understood from the beginning that he was ruling a country whose people had been making and breaking empires for 3,000 years, whose cultural traditions were so deep and so confident that they had absorbed every previous conqueror without much altering their fundamental character. Ptolemy was not a stupid man. He understood that ruling Egypt required legitimacy of a kind that military conquest alone could not supply, and he looked for ways to acquire it. He took the title of pharaoh. He sponsored the Egyptian temples and their priests. He also decided, with the careful calculation that marked everything he did, that Alexandria would be the intellectual capital of the Greek-speaking world, and that the institution which would make it so would be a library on a scale and with an ambition that no previous institution had attempted. The man he turned to for the practical architecture of this project was Demetrius of Phalerum, and the choice tells us something important about how the library was conceived. Demetrius was not a librarian. He was an Athenian politician, a student of Aristotle, a man who had governed Athens on behalf of a Macedonian regent for 10 years with a combination of administrative competence and philosophical ambition that had earned him admirers and enemies in roughly equal numbers. When his political position in Athens collapsed, he arrived in Alexandria as a man in exile, carrying everything he had learned about what a city needed to sustain intellectual life. And what he believed it needed, above all, was an institutional home for knowledge that was separate from the interests of any particular school or sect or patron, a place where the whole of human learning could be gathered and organized and made accessible to those capable of using it. The idea sounds obvious now, because we have had universities and national libraries and archives for long enough that the concept feels natural, feels like something human beings were always going to build eventually. But in the 3rd century before the Common Era, it was not obvious at all. Knowledge lived in scrolls that were privately owned, in schools attached to particular philosophical traditions, in the memories of specialists who transmitted what they knew through oral teaching to selected students. The idea that all of this could be gathered in one place, catalogued, compared, made available to scholars who might otherwise never encounter the traditions of other cultures, other disciplines, other ways of thinking about the same questions, was a genuinely new proposition, and Demetrius was the person who convinced Ptolemy that it was worth building. The first Ptolemy began the project, and the second, Ptolemy II, who is sometimes called Philadelphus, meaning the one who loves his siblings, expanded it with a commitment of money and royal prestige that transformed what his father had started into something on a different scale entirely. It was Ptolemy II who commissioned the aggressive acquisition program, who sent agents to Athens and Rhodes and the great cities of the Eastern Mediterranean with instructions to buy whatever was available and to note what was not, who established the policy of searching ships in the harbour, who created the conditions under which scholars from across the Greek-speaking world found it worth while to come to Alexandria and stay. The library under Ptolemy II became the institutional expression of a clear and simple proposition that the prestige of a dynasty could be measured, among other things, by how much of human knowledge it had chosen to collect and protect to run this institution, to bring some order to the accumulating mass of scrolls and the community of scholars working among them. The Ptolemies appointed a series of head librarians whose names we still know, which is itself a remarkable fact about the survival of institutional memory. Zenodotus of Ephesus was among the first, a scholar of Homer who began the work of creating a systematic catalogue, sorting the collection by subject and author, making decisions about which copies of a text were most reliable, establishing the kind of editorial principles that made it possible to use a collection of this size without being lost in it. After Zenodotus came Callimachus of Cyrene, who produced the Pinax, a bibliographic catalogue of the entire collection that ran, by some accounts, to 120 scrolls, a finding aid for a library so large that you could not browse it. You had to know what you were looking for. The Pinax itself is lost, but references to it in later works tell us something about the scale of the collection it described. Hundreds of thousands of scrolls, organized by subject, within subjects by genre, within genres by author, with biographical notes and assessments of textual reliability that were sophisticated enough to form the basis of subsequent scholarship for centuries. The scholars who came to work in this environment were doing things that had not been done before in quite the way they were doing them, and the things they were doing were not small. Euclid, who may have been among the library's earliest scholars, wrote the Elements, a systematic account of geometry that was still being used as a teaching text in the 19th century and that remained the foundation of mathematical education for more than 2,000 years. Eratosthenes, who became head librarian sometime around the middle of the 3rd century before the Common Era, calculated the circumference of the Earth by measuring the difference in the angle of the sun's shadow between Alexandria and the city of Syene on the summer solstice, a method so elegant and so correct that his result was within a few hundred kilometers of the figure modern measurements see on therms. Aristarchus of Samos, working in Alexandria during the same period, proposed that the Earth moved around the Sun and not the Sun around the Earth, and offered a mathematical framework for the heliocentric model that would not be seriously revisited for 17 centuries, until a Polish canon named Copernicus arrived at the same conclusion by a somewhat different route. Herophilus of Chalcedon conducted the first systematic dissections of the human body in Alexandria, working with the permission of the Ptolemaic rulers in a city that was apparently willing to permit practices that would have been unthinkable in other parts of the Greek world, and wrote descriptions of the brain, the nervous system, the digestive organs, and the reproductive anatomy that establish the vocabulary of anatomy that medicine would use for 2,000 years. Archimedes, whose mathematical achievements would remain unmatched in the ancient world, spent time in Alexandria as a young man, studying with the students of Euclid and developing the friendships and the mathematical correspondences that would sustain his work through the decades he spent in Syracuse. Whether he used the library's collection during that time we do not know for certain, but the connections he formed in Alexandria shaped his intellectual life, and the connections between Alexandrian scholarship and his own work are visible throughout his writings. This was what the library was at its best in the generations when the Ptolemaic dynasty believed in it enough to pay for it. It was a place where the full range of human intellectual achievement, gathered from every culture the Ptolemies could reach, was made available to minds capable of doing something with it. It produced not just individual achievements, but a culture of scholarship, a way of working in which the systematic gathering and critical comparison of sources was understood to be the foundation of any serious intellectual project. The scholars of Alexandria invented philology. The scholars of Alexandria invented philology, the systematic study of texts. Because they had enough texts to compare, they invented literary criticism. Because they had the entire corpus of Greek literature available for analysis, they made mathematics and astronomy and anatomy into sciences in the sense of organized, cumulative, self-correcting bodies of knowledge. Because the institution they worked in made it possible to build on what others had done rather than beginning again from nothing, and all of it depended on the dynasty continuing to believe that it was worth paying for. That is the facts that the story of the library's golden age cannot quite conceal. However dazzling the individual achievements, the scholars and their scrolls and their calculations and their dissections existed because a series of Macedonian kings decided that intellectual prestige was worth the considerable expense of its maintenance. The library was never self-sustaining. It was never publicly funded in any modern sense. It was a royal project, and it flourished when the royal family that built it remained both wealthy enough and interested enough to support it, and it began to decline the moment that either of those conditions started to waver. The morning is coming now, the light beginning to find the tops of the colonnades in the royal quarter. The first scholars of the day making their way through the still cool streets toward the reading rooms, carrying whatever they were thinking about yesterday. The scroll cases will be unlatched. The lamps will be lit. The work will continue for a while yet, in the way that work continues in institutions that have not yet understood they are beginning to fail. The question the next several centuries will answer is not what the library achieved, because the achievement is already accomplished, already written and measured and described. The question is what it takes to lose it, and how long it takes, and whether anyone, at the time, notices it happening. The ship has been in the harbor for less than an hour when the agents come aboard. It arrived from Athens in the early afternoon. Its hold carrying the usual cargo of grain jars and bolts of cloth and cedar planks, and among the cargo, carefully packed in a wooden case lined with fleece, a collection of scrolls belonging to a merchant who had been trading between Athens and Alexandria for 20 years and who regarded the scrolls as both a private pleasure and a mark of cultivat, ion, the kind of thing a prosperous man kept to show that he was more than merely prosperous. The agents are polite. They explain, as they always do, that the scrolls must be inspected, that this is a matter of royal procedure, that the merchant will receive copies of equivalent quality within a few days, along with fair payment for any inconvenience. The merchant has heard of this practice. He has heard that it's difficult to refuse. He watches the agents carry the case off his ship and down the dock toward the building that rises above the harbor district, and he will get the copies as promised, and the payment as promised, and he will never quite shake the feeling that something has been taken from him, even though he cannot precisely say what. Inside the library, the scrolls from the merchant's case are already being unrolled and assessed by a group of scholars whose specific job this is, men who have read enough Greek literature in enough different copies to be able to judge, fairly quickly, whether a given text is an early and reliable version or a later and derivative one, whether the copyist was careful or careless, whether the text is an early and reliable version or a later and derivative one, whether the copyist was careful or careless, contains variants not present in other copies the library already holds. If the text is one the library does not have, it goes directly into the collection. If the library already has the same text, the new copy is compared against the existing ones, and the better reading is preserved, and the worse is set aside but not destroyed, because the principle here is accumulation, not selection, and a scroll that contains even one variant reading of a known text is worth keeping. The scholars work through the afternoon, assessing and cataloguing, adding tags and notes in the precise shorthand that the library's archival system requires, and when they are finished, the scrolls from Athens join their hundreds of thousands of companions in the cases along the walls, and the library is slightly larger than it was this morning. This scene, or something very much like it, played out repeatedly across the long decades of the library's golden age, which is to say the century and a half running roughly from the reign of Ptolemy I through those of his son Ptolemy II and his grandson Ptolemy III. The 3 generations during which the Ptolemaic dynasty was wealthy enough and ambitious enough and, crucially, intellectually curious enough to keep building what the first Ptolemy had begun. It was a project that required sustained commitment at the highest level, not simply because it cost money, though it cost enormous amounts of money, but because it required a particular kind of patience, the patience to keep funding an institution whose return on investment could not be measured in trade balances or military victories or any of the other currencies by which ancient rulers typically calculated the value of their expenditures. You had to believe that knowledge was worth collecting for its own sake, that an institution whose purpose was the accumulation and organization of human understanding was doing something that mattered, even if you could not always say precisely what it mattered for. Ptolemy I believed this, or at least believed it enough to begin the project and to bring Demetrius of Phalerum from Athens to run it. Demetrius arrived in Alexandria as a man who had spent his career at the intersection of philosophy and politics, who had studied with Aristotle and governed Athens and thought seriously about the relationship between knowledge and power, and who had concluded, among other things, that a state which invested in the systematic organization of knowledge was making a form of infrastructure investment, not unlike the investment in roads or walls or harbours, an investment whose benefits accumulated over time in ways that were difficult to predict in advance, but that turned out again and again to be decisive. He had seen Aristotle's library in Athens, a private collection that was the most significant in the Greek world at the time, and he understood both what it was and what it could not be. A private collection depended on a single patron and ended when the patron died or lost interest or lost the money. What Demetrius wanted to build in Alexandria was something that could outlast any individual, an institution with its own momentum and its own reason for existing, independent enough of any single person's enthusiasm to survive the inevitable fluctuations of royal interest and royal attention. The Mouseion, the scholarly community in which the library was embedded, was Demetrius's most important contribution to this institutional project. The word Mouseion means something like House of the Muses, the goddesses who presided over intellectual and artistic endeavor, and it functioned as a kind of community of scholars in residence, men who had been brought to Alexandria from across the Greek-speaking world and given everything they needed to work, housing, food at a common table, access to the library's collection, and most important, the gift of uninterrupted time. They did not have to teach to survive, which was the condition under which almost every other scholar in the ancient world had to work. They did not have to find private patrons or take in students or perform any of the other functions that normally consumed the energy of men who wanted to spend their lives thinking. They simply had to think and to write down what they thought, and to argue with one another over the common table in the evenings, and to add to the body of knowledge that the library was collecting and preserving. It was an arrangement so unusual, so contrary to the normal economics of intellectual life in the ancient world, that it produced, in a relatively short period, an accumulation of intellectual achievement that has rarely been matched in any comparable time and place. The work that came out of the Mouseion in its first century was not a collection of minor advances and incremental improvements. It was foundational. Euclid wrote the Elements in Alexandria, a text so systematic and so complete in its account of geometry that it remained the standard introduction to the subject for more than 2,000 years, still being taught in schools and universities well into the modern era, still providing the logical framework within which mathematical reasoning was understood to operate. The Elements was not simply a compilation of what was already known. It was a reorganization of mathematical knowledge, according to a principle of logical proof and rigorous deduction that had not been applied to the subject with anything like this consistency before, and the reorganization changed what mathematics was, transformed it from a collection of useful techniques into a demonstrative science, a field where every claim was supported by a chain of reasoning that began from agreed premises and could be checked and verified by anyone willing to follow the argument. Eratosthenes of Cyrene became head librarian sometime in the 3rd century before the Common Era, a scholar who worked across an extraordinarily wide range of subjects and whose most famous achievement was a calculation of the Earth's circumference, so elegant in its method that it still functions as a demonstration of what careful observation and simple mathematics can accomplish together. He knew from reports in the library's collection that on the summer solstice in the city of Syene, far to the south on the Nile, the sun at noon stood directly overhead, so that a vertical post cast no shadow and sunlight fell straight down into a deep well. In Alexandria on the same day, a vertical post did cast a shadow, and by measuring the angle of that shadow, Eratosthenes was able to calculate the angle between the sun's rays as they reached the two cities. Since the sun is so far away that its rays arrive essentially parallel, that angle was also the angle between the two cities as measured from the Earth's center. And from that angle, and the known distance between Alexandria and Syene, he could calculate the full circumference of the Earth. His result was within a few hundred kilometers of the figure that modern measurement confirms. He arrived at it using nothing more than a stick, a shadow, a measurement of distance, and the resources of a library that contained the information he needed to set up the calculation. Let the weight of that sit for a moment. A man in the 3rd century before the Common Era, working in a building on the Egyptian coast, calculated the size of the planet he was standing on. He was wrong by a small enough margin that the error is a tribute to his method rather than a criticism of it. He could do this because the library he ran contained the observations from Syene, and because the scholarly community he was part of had developed the mathematical tools that made the calculation possible, and because the institution he worked in had given him the time and the resources to put those things together. The library did not just preserve knowledge, it created the conditions under which new knowledge became possible. Aristarchus of Samos worked in Alexandria in the same period, and arrived at a conclusion so far ahead of its time that it would wait 17 centuries for the intellectual climate to be ready to receive it. He proposed that the Earth moved around the Sun, not the Sun around the Earth, and he offered a mathematical framework that showed how the observed movements of the planets and the stars could be explained by this model. He was wrong about the specific details, about the circular rather than elliptical orbits, but he was right about the fundamental structure, and the fact that he was right made almost no immediate difference, because the heliocentric model contradicted the common-sense observation that the Earth felt stationary and the sky moved, and the philosophical framework that most educated people in the iant world used for thinking about the cosmos, and the model was set aside, noted but not adopted, to wait for Copernicus in the 16th century and Galileo after him, and the long, painful process by which the idea was finally confirmed. Herophilus of Chalcedon conducted the first systematic dissections of the human body in Alexandria, and the word systematic here is doing important work. There had been observations of human anatomy before, made by physicians treating wounds or working with the bodies of the dead in various contexts. But Herophilus conducted deliberate, planned dissections with the explicit purpose of understanding how the body worked, and he wrote descriptions of what he found that established the vocabulary and the conceptual framework of anatomy for the next 2 millennia. He distinguished between arteries and veins. He described the brain and its ventricles, the nervous system and its connections, the structure of the eye and the function of the optic nerve. He is the first person in the historical record to have measured the pulse as a diagnostic tool. He understood, or came close to understanding, that the brain rather than the heart was the seat of intelligence, which was not the consensus view of his time, and would not become the consensus view for several centuries after him. Archimedes visited Alexandria as a young man and formed connections with the scholars working in the Mouseion that would shape his mathematical correspondence for the rest of his life. He went home to Syracuse on the island of Sicily and produced, over the following decades, a body of pure mathematical work without parallel in the ancient world, including the calculation of pi with a precision that would not be significantly improved for nearly 1,000 years, the development of a method for calculating areas and volumes using a technique that anticipates the integral calculus. Newton and Leibniz would develop 19 centuries later, and the invention of mechanical devices so effective that they significantly delayed the Roman siege of Syracuse for 3 years. He sent his proofs to the scholars in Alexandria, because they were the people most capable of understanding them, because the library and the Mouseion had created a community of mathematical readers sophisticated enough to follow his work and to respond to it in ways that sustained the development of his thinking. What was being created in Alexandria across the 3rd and 2nd centuries before the Common Era was not just a collection of scrolls, though the collection was already larger than anything the world had previously assembled. It was a way of doing intellectual work, a set of practices and standards and institutional arrangements that made certain kinds of achievement possible that had not been possible before. The principle that you should check your sources, that you should compare different versions of a text before trusting any single version, that you should build your argument on the best available evidence and acknowledge where the evidence was uncertain or disputed. These principles came out of the practices of the Alexandrian scholars, who had enough texts to compare and enough institutional support to take the comparison seriously. The critical edition, the bibliographic catalogue, the systematic dissection, the measurement that produces a number rather than a description. These were all Alexandrian inventions or Alexandrian refinements, and they changed what scholarship meant. All of it depended on the dynasty that had built it. This is the thing that the golden age of the library makes easy to forget, because the achievements are so dazzling and the institution is so easy to imagine as a natural feature of the intellectual landscape, something that simply was rather than something that was paid for. But Demetrius of Phalerum, who understood institutional fragility better than most people because he had lost his own political position, suddenly and completely, and arrived in Alexandria with everything he knew about what institutions needed to survive, understood this clearly enough. The scholars in the Mouseion ate at the king's table. The agents who boarded ships in the harbor served at the king's direction. The scroll cases that lined the reading rooms had been purchased or confiscated using royal funds. The head librarian was a royal appointment. The library was, in every material sense, a projection of Ptolemaic power, and its existence depended entirely on the continued willingness of the Ptolemaic family to project power in this particular direction, toward learning rather than armies, toward scrolls rather than stone. For a century and a half, that willingness held. The question that the following centuries would answer, slowly and without any single dramatic moment of resolution, was what happened when it began to waver. And for a long time, that was the shape of the world in Alexandria. A city organized at its most serious level around the idea that knowledge was worth the cost of its preservation, that a state which housed and fed its scholars was doing something not merely useful, but essential. We can move forward now, 2 or 3 generations along, to the moment when that idea began to feel less obvious to the people responsible for paying for it. A new kind of Ptolemy had arrived on the throne, one who had inherited the library, but not quite the conviction that had built it, and the difference between those two things, inheriting an institution and believing in one, turns out, as we will see, to be everything. The head librarian has died, and the position has been empty for several months now, which would not have been unusual in itself, since these appointments take time and the Ptolemaic court has other matters to attend to. What becomes unusual, and what those watching closely might have noticed, is that the months stretch into a year, and the scholars in the Mouseion, who rely on the head librarian to advocate for their funding and to manage the acquisitions program and to maintain the relationships with officials who control the royal treasury, have begun to sense that the person best positioned to fight for the library's needs is simply absent. The collection is still intact. The reading rooms are still open. The scholars are still working. But something that was once actively maintained has begun to be merely preserved, which is, as institutions go, the first stage of a process that ends in decline. This moment, in the 2nd century before the Common Era, is where the library's long descent begins, not with fire, not with violence, not with any dramatic act that could be named and assigned to a particular villain, but with the gradual withdrawal of the attention that had built it. The Ptolemaic dynasty in the 2nd century was not the dynasty of the 3rd. The first 2 Ptolemies had been soldiers who became kings, men formed by the chaos of Alexander's wars and the competition of the successor kingdoms. Men who understood that prestige required effort, and that effort required investment, and who had the energy and the focus to make an institution like the library real. The later Ptolemies were men who had grown up in palaces, heirs to a settled power that no longer needed to be invented from nothing, whose intellectual interests ran toward the more conventional cultural displays that power had always used to legitimate itself, and whose attention to the specific, expensive, difficult project of collecting and organizing the whole of human knowledge was considerably less intense. There is something almost imperceptible about the way an institution begins to lose its footing. Something that resists the kind of clear narrative that dramatic events supply. No one in Alexandria in the middle years of the 2nd century before the Common Era would have said that the library was dying. They would have said that things were a little more difficult than they had been, that the budget was somewhat reduced, that the new head librarian was a competent man, but perhaps not quite the caliber of his predecessors, that the acquisitions had slowed for the moment but would surely recover. These are the sentences that institutions tell themselves in the early stages of decline. And they are not entirely wrong, and that's what makes them dangerous, because they are just true enough to forestall the kind of urgent response that the actual situation requires. The political situation of the Ptolemaic kingdom in the 2nd century before the Common Era was also genuinely difficult in ways that made investment in scholarship feel like a luxury rather than a necessity. Rome was growing, and the growth of Rome was not a distant problem that could be ignored. The Ptolemies watched with considerable anxiety as Roman power extended across the Mediterranean in ways that made every other political arrangement feel provisional, dependent on the Romans' continuing goodwill. Maintaining good relations with Rome required money and diplomacy, and the kind of constant political attention that left little energy for the management of a research institution. The library did not disappear from royal concern all at once. It simply moved down the list of priorities. And once something moves down a list of priorities in an institution that depends entirely on active patronage, the movement tends to continue in the same direction. There is a specific Ptolemy who stands as the clearest illustration of what this withdrawal looked like in human terms. Ptolemy VIII, who ruled in the second half of the 2nd century before the Common Era, was a man whose relationship with Alexandria was defined more by political brutality than by intellectual patronage. A king who expelled scholars from the city during periods of conflict, who used the cultural institutions of Alexandria as political leverage rather than intellectual investments, who understood the library as part of his inheritance rather than as something he had any particular obligation to sustain. The scholars he expelled scattered to other cities, carrying their knowledge and their habits of work with them, finding positions in Athens and Antioch and Pergamon, which had been building its own library in deliberate competition with Alexandria, and which benefited from the diaspora of Alexandrian expertise. When the political situation settled and some of the scholars returned, they returned to an institution that had been without its most active members for years, that had not been acquiring new texts in the interim, that had not been producing the kind of scholarship that attracted new scholars, and that had fallen in the estimation of the learned world in ways that were difficult to reverse. Pergamon deserves a moment of attention here, because it represents something important about how the library's decline was not simply an internal Ptolemaic failure, but part of a larger shift in the geography of knowledge. The rulers of Pergamon, in what is now Western Turkey, decided, sometime in the 3rd century before the Common Era, that they too wanted a great library, a collection that would make their city a center of learning and give their kingdom a cultural prestige to match the Ptolemies. They built it, over several generations, into a collection of considerable size, and they staffed it with scholars who were partly recruited from Alexandria and partly trained in their own scholarly tradition. The existence of Pergamon as an alternative meant that the Ptolemies no longer had a monopoly on the institutional infrastructure of Greek scholarship, that scholars who found the atmosphere in Alexandria uncongenial had somewhere else to go, and that the unique advantage the library had enjoyed in its 1st century, being the only institution of its kind in the world, was no longer quite what it had been. The violence that periodically tore through Alexandria in the late Ptolemaic period added a different kind of damage to the institutional damage of neglect. Alexandria in the 2nd and 1st centuries before the Common Era was a city of multiple communities whose relationships with one another were complex and frequently hostile. Greeks and Egyptians and Jews and others occupying the same city, but not the same world, separated by language and religion and legal status, and the deep suspicion that developed between communities that have been living in proximity without integration for generations. When political tensions within the Ptolemaic court spilled into the streets, as they did repeatedly across this period, the violence was not surgical or targeted. It spread through the city in the way that urban violence always does, consuming whatever it found, and the library and its surrounding buildings were not protected from what happened in the streets around them by anything more substantial than the fact that most people caught up in the violence had more immediate concerns than a collection of scrolls. The exact nature and extent of the damage the library sustained through this period of intermittent crisis is something historians have debated without reaching agreement, which is itself a significant fact. If the damage had been dramatic and total, the ancient sources would have recorded it far more clearly than they do. What those sources suggest, taken together, is a picture of gradual attrition, the collection less complete than it once was, the scholarly community less active, the acquisitions program reduced from its former scale, the head librarians less distinguished than their predecessors. These are the signs of an institution losing ground rather than one that has been destroyed. And the distinction matters because it means the library's decline was not the result of any single catastrophic event, but of the accumulation of small failures that individually seemed manageable and collectively proved irreversible. Rest here for a moment. In the reading rooms of the library, as they would have been in the middle years of the 2nd century before the Common Era, when the decline is still early enough that the institution functions, still produces scholarship, still receives visitors who come specifically to use its resources. The scroll cases still receives visitors who come specifically to use its resources. The scroll cases are still maintained. Scholars still arrive from Athens and Antioch and Rhodes because there is nowhere else in the world with this depth of collection. Nowhere else where a text from a tradition not your own can be found, along with scholarly commentary on it, along with different editions to compare. The institution is diminished but not dead. The damage is real but not yet irreversible. Julius Caesar arrived in Alexandria in the summer of 48 BCE, not as a conqueror of Egypt, but as a pursuer of Pompey, the rival he had been chasing since their conflict began to fracture the Roman world. Pompey was murdered before Caesar could reach him, and Caesar found himself in a complex and dangerous political situation, a guest of uncertain welcome in the Ptolemaic court, mediating the dynastic conflict between the young Ptolemy XIII and his sister Cleopatra, navigating a city that had no particular reason to welcome him and considerable reason to resent his presence. The harbor fire that every subsequent account of the library's destruction begins with was not a deliberate act of cultural destruction. It was a military incident of the kind that war produces when it encounters a densely built city near water, and its relationship to the library is very much more complicated than the story that grew from it suggests. The ancient sources that discuss the harbor fire are fewer in number and less definitive in their claims than the subsequent tradition would lead you to expect. Caesar himself, in his account of the Alexandrian campaign, mentions the harbor fire without giving it particular significance or describing it as a catastrophic loss to scholarship. Plutarch, writing more than a century after the event, says that Caesar was forced to set fire to the ships in the harbor to prevent them from being used against him, and that the fire spread to the docks and burned a large number of books that had been stored there awaiting shipment. This is a significant detail that the myth consistently drops. Not the library itself, but books stored in a warehouse near the docks, books that were awaiting export. Almost certainly a commercial shipment of copies made for sale rather than the irreplaceable originals from the library's own holdings. Strabo, who actually visited Alexandria not long after Caesar's time and wrote about the city with the care of a practiced observer, describes the Mouseion and its scholarly community as functioning institutions, but says nothing about the library having been destroyed, which he would certainly have noted if destruction on the scale the later tradition describes had actually occurred. Dio Cassius, writing in the 3rd century of the Common Era, says the fire burned the books stored in warehouses near the harbor. The picture that emerges from these sources, read carefully rather than selectively, is of a dock fire that destroyed a commercial shipment of books and that was subsequently magnified over the course of centuries of retelling into something it was not. The specific number that Plutarch gives for the books lost which some manuscripts record as 40,000 and others as 400,000, is itself an indication of how the story grew in transmission. The variation in the number across different manuscript traditions tells us that the figure was approximate from the beginning, a gesture at scale rather than an accounting, and that as the story was copied and retold, the gesture became more dramatic rather than more precise. This is how myths work, not through deliberate fabrication, but through the natural tendency of storytelling to round upward, to make the loss more total, the villain more culpable, the drama more complete, until the warehouse fire becomes the inferno and the commercial shipment becomes the collection of all human knowledge. The gap between what the ancient sources actually say and what the story became over the following centuries is instructive and worth sitting with carefully. By the medieval period, the account of Caesar burning the library had become standard, and by the early modern period, it had become the single most familiar fact about the institution, the moment around which all subsequent accounts organized themselves. How does a warehouse fire that contemporary sources barely registered become the defining catastrophe of ancient intellectual history? The answer is partly about narrative convenience and partly about the specific needs that the story was being called on to meet at different historical moments. A dramatic single moment of destruction is far easier to comprehend and communicate than the slow, undramatic process of institutional decline through budget reductions and administrative inattention and the gradual diversion of patronage toward other projects. A named villain makes the loss feel comprehensible in a way that an unnamed process does not. Caesar was a figure large enough to carry the weight of the story, famous enough to make the loss feel significant, morally complex enough to make the question of blame interesting. The story once told was repeated, and the repetition made it feel established, and the established feeling made it resistant to the careful examination that might have questioned it. The scholars in Alexandria, in the months and years after Caesar's departure, continued to work. This is the most important single fact about the harbor fire and what it did and did not destroy. The library continued to function. Scholars continued to visit. Texts continued to be copied and studied and debated, and if the fire had destroyed the library's holdings in any comprehensive way, the scholarly life of Alexandria couldn't have continued as it did. The continuation of Alexandrian intellectual life after 48 BCE is the clearest possible evidence that what burned was not the library. What burned was a warehouse. What was lost was real but recoverable in kind, even if the specific copies were gone. What the fire story did, in the centuries of its telling, was provide a single clean explanation for a loss that was actually the product of generations of small decisions, insufficient budgets, political indifference, and the slow entropy that affects every institution that loses the active commitment of the people with the power to sustain it. The fire story is not simply wrong. It is a symptom, and understanding it as a symptom rather than a cause is the key to understanding everything else about the library's history. It is the first instance of a pattern that will repeat itself across the following centuries, in which a single dramatic event is assigned responsibility for a decline that was already underway before the event occurred and would have continued regardless of whether it had. The library was losing ground before Caesar arrived in Alexandria. It would have continued losing ground if he had never come. The fire gave the decline a face, a villain, a date, and a drama that the actual process of institutional death through neglect and underfunding and political indifference doesn't naturally supply. Stories need causes. Libraries die from the absence of causes, from the absence of the active will to maintain them, and that absence is very difficult to turn into a story that travels across centuries and remains vivid at the other end. The story of the fire has been told now, and it's the wrong story. and we can set it aside and move forward into the centuries that follow. Because those centuries have their own violence and their own neglect and their own contributions to the library's long ending, the city is still there, still extraordinary, still the largest and most cosmopolitan place in the Mediterranean world. But the institution that had defined its intellectual life is changing, and the change is not something that can be reversed by a single act of political will. Let us move forward several centuries, then, into the era of Roman Alexandria, when the library has become something smaller and more fragile than what it was, housed now in a different building in a different part of the city, still attended by scholars, still holding scrolls that cannot be found anywhere else, but present in the city's life in the way that an aging institution is present, respected and somewhat overlooked. The Serapeum stands on a hill above the city, visible from the harbor on clear days, its columns rising above the roofline of the streets below in a way that gives it an air of permanence that its actual situation by the 1st century of the Common Era only partly justifies. It is a temple to Serapis, the syncretic deity that the first Ptolemies had promoted as a god for both their Greek and Egyptian subjects, a deity who combined elements of several traditions into something intended to be accessible across cultural lines. Attached to the temple is a library, a working collection of scrolls that is in some sense the surviving remnant or successor of the great library of the Ptolemaic age. Smaller than the original by a very large margin, its relationship to the original institution disputed even by ancient writers who discussed it. The scholars who work here do not call themselves librarians of the Library of Alexandria. They know they are something less than that, something that carries the memory and the purpose of that institution without quite being able to claim its scale or its authority. They work anyway, in the rooms adjacent to the temple, in an institution that is already a memory of itself. A book containing a shorter version of a longer story. Alexandria, in the 1st and 2nd centuries of the Common Era, is a city of extraordinary density and extraordinary tension. It is the 2nd city of the Roman Empire, after Rome itself, and it functions as the principal port through which the grain of Egypt, the agricultural surplus that fed Rome's population, passes on its way west. Its population is enormous for the ancient world, perhaps 500,000 people or more at the height of Roman imperial power, packed into a grid of streets that the Ptolemies had designed for a city considerably smaller than what Alexandria had become. The communities that share this space do not share it easily. The Greek-speaking population and the Jewish population, both substantial and both with their own institutional structures and their own claims to Roman legal recognition, have a relationship that oscillates between uneasy coexistence and outright violence, with the violence erupting periodically in ways that leave significant portions of the city damaged and significant portions of its population dead. The Egyptian population, which has its own traditions and its own grievances with the communities that arrived after the Macedonian conquest, is a further complication in a city that has always been easier to build than to govern. The Jewish community in Alexandria was one of the largest outside of Judea and had been present in the city since its founding, producing in the Ptolemaic period a tradition of Greek-language Jewish scholarship that includes the Septuagint, the Greek translation of the Hebrew scriptures that was made in Alexandria and that would have an enormous influence on the development of both Judaism and Christianity. The relationship between the Jewish community and the library's intellectual tradition was complex and significant, and the violence that periodically targeted the Jewish community also damaged the broader intellectual culture of the city. The pogrom under the Emperor Caligula in the 1st century of the Common Era, which resulted in the destruction of synagogues and the killing of a large number of Alexandrian Jews, was also a moment of broader civic breakdown in which other institutions were threatened. The Jewish revolt under Trajan in the early 2nd century was suppressed with a severity that devastated not only the Jewish community, but significant portions of the city itself, leaving neighborhoods destroyed and populations scattered in ways that the city's scholarly life couldn't entirely avoid. Roman rule brought its own inconsistencies to the question of who supported scholarship in Alexandria and to what degree. Some emperors were genuine patrons of the Mouseion, understood its value, provided it with funding and status. Others were indifferent. The institution continued to function, but its relationship to imperial power was fundamentally different from its relationship to Ptolemaic power, because the Ptolemies had built it and felt a proprietary attachment to it, while Roman emperors inherited it along with everything else in Egypt, and felt no particular obligation to maintain it beyond a general interest in being seen as cultured ruler. The Mouseion of the Roman period was a functioning scholarly community, but it was a diminished one, its budget uncertain, its acquisitions reduced, its relationship to the collection in the Serapeum indirect and sometimes contentious. The Emperor Aurelian's campaign to retake Alexandria from the rebel queen Zenobia in the year 272 of the Common Era caused significant damage to the Mouseion, the royal quarter where the original library had stood. Damage serious enough that whatever remained of the original collection in that part of the city was likely destroyed or scattered at this point, if anything substantial still remained there. The sources for this period are thin and the specific losses difficult to specify, but the campaign marks another moment of civic destruction in a city that had experienced many such moments, and it's reasonable to assume that an institution already under pressure would have found this further instability difficult to absorb. Pause here for a moment. In the late 3rd century of the Common Era, when the Serapeum still stands and the scholars still gather in the rooms beside it, the intellectual tradition of Alexandria is thinner than it was. The community of scholars smaller, the collection less comprehensive, but the tradition of inquiry is still present, still producing work, still attracting men who want to spend their lives thinking carefully about mathematics and philosophy and the natural world. It is worth registering this before moving on, because what comes next tends to overwhelm it in the historical memory. The tradition is still alive. It is fragile and reduced and dependent on circumstances that are about to become considerably more hostile, but it's still alive. The religious transformation of the Roman Empire in the 4th century of the Common Era is one of the most significant events in the history of the ancient world, and its consequences for the intellectual culture of Alexandria were both direct and devastating. The Emperor Constantine's adoption of Christianity as a favored religion and the subsequent Christianization of the empire's official institutions did not immediately or automatically threaten pagan scholarship, because Christianity in the early 4th century was itself a diverse and intellectually active tradition, with scholars of considerable sophistication who saw no necessary conflict between Christian faith and Greek philosophy. But the trajectory of imperial religious policy across the 4th century moved steadily toward the exclusion of other traditions, and the scholars of the Serapeum, who worked in a pagan temple and within a philosophical tradition that was grounded in the Greek intellectual inheritance rather than in Christian scripture, found themselves on the wrong side of an increasingly sharp line between tired and unsanctioned ways of thinking. The Emperor Theodosius issued edicts in the final decades of the 4th century of the Common Era that effectively banned pagan religious practice across the empire, ordering the closure of pagan temples and the cessation of traditional sacrifices and religious ceremonies. In 391 of the Common Era, the Bishop of Alexandria, a man named Theophilus, who had the energy and the political connections of someone who understood that religious transformation was also a transformation of power, led or encouraged an assault on the Serapeum that resulted in the destruction of the temple itself, the burning or removal of its contents, and the conversion of the site to Christian use. Ancient sources differ on the details and on the extent of the library's losses in this event, though the physical destruction of the temple that housed the scholarly community was a blow from which the remnant institution of Alexandrian learning did not recover in any organized institutional sense. The scholars scattered, those who could find other positions, those who had means to sustain themselves elsewhere. The specific collection that had been housed in the Serapeum was gone, or largely gone, or removed to purposes other than scholarship. What remained after 391 was not an institution, but a tradition, carried now not in buildings and collections, but in individual scholars who had been trained in the Alexandrian way and who continued to teach and write in the city and elsewhere. The most extraordinary of these figures, and the one whose fate brings the story of Alexandrian intellectual culture to its most specific and most human moment, is Hypatia of Alexandria, and she deserves to be understood as something considerably more complex and considerable than the icon of martyred rationalism that she has sometimes become in subsequent commemoration. Hypatia was born sometime in the middle decades of the 4th century of the Common Era, the daughter of Theon of Alexandria, a mathematician and astronomer who was himself one of the most significant scholars of the late Alexandrian tradition, an editor and commentator on Euclid and Ptolemy, whose careful work was responsible for preserving the versions of those texts that have come down to us. She was educated by her father and within the broader intellectual community of Alexandria, and she became a mathematician and philosopher of genuine accomplishment, producing commentaries on mathematical and astronomical works that were sophisticated enough to be used and cited by subsequent scholars. We do not have her own writings, which is itself a significant loss, but we have extensive references to her work and to her teaching in the letters and writings of her students, several of whom maintained correspondence with her over many years and whose letters survive to give us a picture of her mind and her character. Hypatia taught philosophy in the tradition that is called Neoplatonism, a tradition that had developed from Plato's thought across the centuries and that represented, by the late 4th century, the most vital and sophisticated strand of pagan intellectual life in the Mediterranean world. Her students came from across the Eastern Mediterranean, some of them Christian, some pagan, all of them drawn by a reputation for philosophical depth and pedagogical skill that spread well beyond Alexandria. The tradition she worked in was not merely theoretical, it was a set of practices of mind, ways of engaging with questions that had to be cultivated through long study and direct teaching. She was not simply a figure in an intellectual tradition. She was, by the accounts of those who knew her, an exceptional person, someone whose combination of intellectual authority and personal integrity gave her a position in Alexandrian civic life that went beyond what her scholarly achievements alone would have warranted. She was consulted by civic leaders. She maintained friendships and correspondences with people of considerable political power. She moved through the city with a freedom that was unusual for women in the ancient world, and she did so without apparent apology or concession. The letters of Synesius of Cyrene, a student of Hypatia who later became a Christian bishop, give us the clearest picture we have of what it was like to study with her. He describes a teacher who encouraged rigorous questioning rather than passive reception, who expected her students to work through difficulties themselves rather than simply accepting her conclusions, who understood philosophy not as a set of doctrines to be memorized, but as a set of practices to be cultivated, habits of mind that had to be developed through repeated exercise and sustained attention. He writes with a warmth and a gratitude that suggests she was not simply a formidable intellect, but a person of genuine kindness, someone who took her students seriously as individuals and whose pedagogical commitment extended beyond the formal setting of the classroom into a sustained interest in the development of their minds over years of correspondence. These letters are almost the only first-hand testimony we have about what Hypatia was actually like as a thinker and a teacher, and they paint a portrait of someone who understood the tradition she worked in, not as a monument to be preserved, but as a living practice to be continued and extended. Her mathematical work, which she produced partly in collaboration with her father Theon and partly independently, was focused on making the great texts of the Alexandrian tradition more accessible and more reliable. She edited and commented on works by Diophantus and Apollonius of Perga, producing versions of these texts that were clearer and more accurate than the copies then available, and her editions became the basis of subsequent transmission of those works through the Byzantine period. This is scholarship in the most unglamorous sense. The careful, painstaking work of comparison and emendation that keeps a text alive across centuries of copying and recopying. And it matters more than it looks, because a text that is not being actively maintained by someone who understands it is a text that is slowly becoming unreadable as errors accumulate and the context needed to understand difficult passages is gradually lost. The city she moved through was also becoming more dangerous, not because of any single cause, but because of the combination of religious change, political instability, and civic breakdown that characterized Alexandria in the early 5th century of the Common Era. The Christian community in Alexandria was not monolithic. It was divided between factions with different theological positions and different political affiliations, and those divisions expressed themselves in violence as well as in argument. The Bishop of Alexandria in the early 5th century was a man named Cyril, who pursued his theological and political agenda with a ruthlessness that attracted admiring description from some contemporaries and horrified description from others. Cyril was in conflict during the years of Hypatia's activity with the Roman prefect of Alexandria, a man named Orestes, and Hypatia was associated with Orestes, had advised him, was seen as belonging to the political and cultural network that Cyril was in the process of dismantling. In the spring of 415 of the Common Era, Hypatia was returning through the city when she was seized by a mob whose composition and whose relationship to Cyril's authority are disputed in the ancient sources, but whose action is not disputed. She was taken to a nearby building and killed with a violence that the ancient sources record with a deliberate specificity as something understood to be significant by those witnessing it. It was a killing designed not merely to end a life, but to make a statement about the body of the woman and the tradition of thought she represented. And it achieved that purpose with an efficiency that would not have surprised anyone who had been watching the direction of Alexandrian politics across the preceding years. Hypatia had not worked in the library in any institutional sense. The library, in any meaningful form, was already gone by her time. She worked in the tradition that the library had sustained, in the intellectual culture that the Mouseion had created across its centuries of operation, in the practices of careful reading and rigorous argument and the systematic pursuit of understanding that the Alexandrian scholars had made into something that could be taught and transmitted. Her death was not the library's death. It was something more precise and more lasting than that. It was the moment when the intellectual culture the library had created became something that Alexandria could no longer protect, when the city that had built the institution of organized inquiry became a city where a person who embodied that inquiry could be torn apart in the street, and the act could go unpunished and uncommented on by the authorities who were supposed to maintain the city's ordae. And fuel palatum. The library had been declining for centuries before Hypatia died. The culture it had built declined further after her. The connection between those two things is not a simple chain of cause and effect, but something more diffuse, more atmospheric, more like the slow change in climate that makes certain things possible and certain other things not, until one day you look around and the thing you were trying to preserve is already gone. What the death of Hypatia closes in the story of Alexandrian intellectual culture is not the story of the library itself, but the story of the city's willingness to sustain the kind of life the library had made possible. And we can move forward now into the 2 centuries that follow, into a city that is still ancient and still significant, but that is carrying its famous institution more as a memo than as a reality. The physical evidence of what the library had been is still present in the city, in various forms, in the reading rooms that have become other things, in the traditions of scholarship that persist in diminished forms in various parts of the city, in the reputation that Alexandria carries across the Mediterranean world as the place where the great library once stood. We move forward now to the 7th century of the Common Era, to the moment that later legend would make the library's definitive end, to see what was actually there when the Arab armies arrived. The general Amr ibn al-As rode into Alexandria in 641 of the Common Era at the head of an army that had, over the preceding year and a half, completed one of the most remarkable military campaigns in the history of the ancient world. The Arab armies that emerged from the Arabian Peninsula in the decade following the death of the Prophet Muhammad had moved with a speed and coherence that the great powers of the region had completely failed to anticipate. Sweeping through Syria and Mesopotamia and then turning toward Egypt, the richest province of the Eastern Roman Empire, the grain source without which Constantinople itself would struggle. Alexandria fell after a siege of several months, and Amr entered a city that was still, by the standards of the 7th century, one of the most extraordinary places in the world. Its streets still carrying the grid that the Ptolemaic architects had laid out nearly 1,000 years before, its harbors still active, its population still diverse, and still capable of surprising a general who expected submission and found instead a city with very strong ideas about its own importance. Amr himself, in his surviving letters and in the accounts of those who knew him, comes across as a man of considerable political sophistication, someone who understood that governing a city like Alexandria required conciliation and administrative skill rather than the straightforward application of military force that had won it for him. He appears to have been genuinely curious about what he had conquered, to have engaged with the intellectual and religious life of the city rather than simply imposing new structures over the old ones. The picture that emerges from the early Arabic sources describing the conquest and its immediate aftermath is of an administrator trying to manage a complex situation with a minimum of disruption, not of a man ordering the systematic destruction of the city's cultural heritage. This does not make him a saint or a patron of learning in any sustained sense. It makes him what he appears to have been, a competent military commander trying to consolidate a difficult conquest, which is a very different thing from the character who appears in Bar-Hebrius's story 6 centuries later. The city that Amr entered was also a city whose relationship with the library was, by 641 of the Common Era, one of memory rather than of present reality. We do not know, and the sources do not allow us to know with confidence whether anything that could meaningfully be called a library of the Alexandrian tradition still existed anywhere in the city at this point. The Serapeum had been destroyed a quarter of a millennium before. The Mouseion had declined across the 5th and 6th centuries as imperial patronage fluctuated, and the intellectual culture of Alexandria became increasingly Christian and therefore increasingly centered on the cathedral and the monastic schools, rather than on the pagan philosophical institutions that had defined the city's scholarly life in earlier centuries. There were certainly books in Alexandria in 641, in churches and monasteries and private collections. But whether there was anything that could properly be called the library, an organized public collection maintained as a scholarly institution, is genuinely uncertain, and the most careful historians tend to conclude that there was not. The legend that attaches itself to Omar's conquest has a specificity that legends always seem to have, the kind of detail that makes a story feel reported rather than invented. According to this legend, a man named John the Grammarian, a scholar of some standing who had survived into the Arab period and gained access to Omar, asked the Arab general about the fate of the books in the royal library, presumably meaning whatever collection he knew of in the city. Amr, according to the story, wrote to the Caliph Omar in Medina asking for instructions, and the Caliph responded with the logic that has given this story its particular resonance across subsequent centuries. If the books agreed with the Quran, they were redundant and unnecessary. If they disagreed with the Quran, they were heretical and dangerous. Either way, they should be destroyed. The story goes on to say that the books were distributed among the 4,000 bathhouses of Alexandria to be used as fuel for heating the water, and that it took 6 months to burn them all. The story has 2 problems, and they are both significant. The first is the source. The account does not appear in any contemporary or near-contemporary source. It appears for the first time in a chronicle written by an Abul Faraj, also known as Bar Hebraeus, in the 13th century of the Common Era, which is to say roughly 600 years after the events it purports to describe. 600 years is a long time for a story about the destruction of a major institution to remain unrecorded, particularly when the destruction was allegedly so vast and so specific that it took 6 months of continuous burning to complete. The silence of the earlier sources is not absolute, but it's notable, and it's the kind of silence that historians who deal with medieval sources have learned to take seriously, because the absence of a dramatic event from sources that would have had reason to record it is often more significant than its presence in later sources that had reason to invent it. The scholar who first set down the Omar story, Abul Faraj Bar Hebraeus, was a bishop of the Syriac Christian Church writing in the 13th century, a period when the memory of the Crusades and the ongoing competition between Christian and Islamic powers over the Holy Land made the narrative of Islamic cultural destruction particularly appealing to Christian audiences. Bar Hebraeus was an erudite man who wrote extensively about history and philosophy, and he is not to be understood as a simple fabricator of convenient lies. It is more likely that he was transmitting a story that had been circulating in oral tradition for some time, a story that had accumulated its specific details, the conversation between John and Amr, the letter to the Caliph, the bathhouses, and the 6 months of burning, in the way that oral traditions do, through the gradual accretion of plausible-seeming specificity that makes a story feel authoritative. The problem is that authoritative-seeming specificity and historical accuracy are not the same thing, and in the absence of any corroborating source from the centuries between the conquest and Bar Hebraeus' account, the story's specificity cannot do the work of evidence that the story's tellers and retellers have asked it to do. The second problem is the plausibility of the story, given what we know about the early Islamic world's attitude toward knowledge. The House of Wisdom that the Abbasid caliphs would establish in Baghdad less than 2 centuries after the conquest of Alexandria was one of the great institutions of medieval scholarship, a center for the translation and study of Greek scientific and philosophical texts that was directly responsible for preserving and extending the Alexandrian intellectual inheritance. The Quran itself praises learning and the act of reading. The early Islamic world produced scholars of extraordinary accomplishment in mathematics, astronomy, medicine, and philosophy, and many of these scholars worked explicitly within the Greek tradition that the Alexandrian library had preserved. The idea that the early Islamic rulers would have destroyed what they actually went on to treasure and extend requires a level of inconsistency that strains credulity, and the more historians examine the context in which the story arose, the clearer it becomes that it arose in a specific political climate, centuries after the supposed events, in a context where there were particular reasons to cuss the early Islamic world as a destroyer of civilization. The specific figure of 4,000 bathhouses, given in some versions of the story as the number of establishments supplied with books for fuel, is itself revealing. 4,000 bathhouses in a single city, even the largest city of the ancient Mediterranean world, is a number so far beyond plausibility that it reads less like a remembered detail than like a narrative intensification, a number chosen to make the loss feel total, to leave no room for any residual survival, to close every possible escape route through which the books might have been saved. It is the kind of number that belongs to legend rather than to record, and its presence in the story is a small but significant indication of how far the account had moved from any possible grounding in eyewitness testimony by the time it was written down. Rest here for a moment with what we know and what we do not know. We know that Alexandria fell to Arab forces in 641. We know that the city continued to exist and to function under Arab rule, that it remained a significant port and a center of commerce, that Christian communities continued to operate there, that the intellectual traditions of the late antique world didn't simply vanish from the city overnight. We do not know whether any meaningful library existed to be destroyed. We do not know whether anyone systematically gathered and burned books. We do not know whether John the grammarian and his conversation with Amr and the caliph's response are historical or invented. The story of the Omar legend fits, as the Caesar story fits, into a pattern that the library's history keeps producing. A single dramatic event, a named villain, a moment of decisive destruction, assigned after the fact to explain a loss that was actually the product of centuries of accumulated neglect, violence, political change, and institutional decay. The Omar legend didn't simply arise from nowhere. It arose in the context of the Crusades, in a period of intense conflict between Christian and Islamic civilizations, in a moment when writers on the Christian side had particular reasons to construct a narrative of Islamic barbarism, and particular reasons to reach back into history to find the evidence for it. The library was the obvious candidate, the most famous intellectual institution of the ancient world, the loss of whose holdings could be used to indict any civilization that could be plausibly connected to that loss. What is remarkable about the legend, and what makes it so durable, is that it doesn't require its audience to know anything about the actual history of the library in order to accept it. It requires only the prior knowledge that the library existed and that it is now gone, and those two facts, combined with a specific and memorable villain in the form of a caliph issuing an absurd logical decree, produce a story that is complete and satisfying, and that travels very well across centuries and cultures. It's, in the technical sense, a good story. It has a clear cause and a clear effect. It assigns responsibility unambiguously. It produces a clean moral, which is that barbarism destroys what civilization creates, and that the destruction of knowledge is the act of an enemy of humanity. These are things that audiences across many centuries and many contexts have been willing to believe, and the willingness of the audience to believe a story is one of the primary forces that keeps the story alive. The Omar legend is the third repetition of the same pattern that we have now seen 3 times across the long history of the library's decline. Caesar blamed for what neglect had already accomplished before he arrived. Theophilus and Cyril and the Christian mobs blamed for what centuries of political indifference and institutional decay had already accomplished before the violence of the late 4th and early 5th centuries. The Arabs blamed for what time and attrition and the gradual failure of successive political orders to sustain the institution had already accomplished before the first Arab soldier set foot in Egypt. Every age finds the villain it needs. Every age constructs the story of the library's destruction that suits its own understanding of where barbarism comes from and where civilization is threatened. And in the finding of villains and the construction of stories, the actual process by which the library died, slow and collective, and distributed across 6 centuries of small decisions that nobody at the time believed would matter, becomes harder and harder to see. The library did not die in a fire. It did not die in a moment. It died the way everything important dies when the people with the power to sustain it choose not to, in the accumulation of individual decisions that were each, at the time, defensible, each, at the time, seemingly not quite final, until collectively they produced a result that no one had intended and that everyone, subsequently, needed someone else to have caused. There is something almost consoling about the myth of the catastrophic destruction, and it is worth acknowledging this because the consolation is not entirely false. If the library died in a fire, or in the decree of a caliph, or in the violence of a Christian mob, then its loss was someone's crime and someone's responsibility, and the rest of us, who were not there and did not light the fire and did not issue the decree, are absolved. The more honest account, in which the library died through the accumulated inattention of hundreds of people across 6 centuries, through budget decisions that each seemed reasonable at the time, and through political priorities that were not unreasonable given what each set of decision-makers knew and valued, offers no such absolution. It implicates everyone who has ever been responsible for an institution and chosen, for understandable reasons, to let it slip a little further down the list of priorities. The myth is more comfortable. The truth is more instructive. The myth is more comfortable, and we have spent enough time with it. We can let it rest now. The fire and the caliph and the villain and the single catastrophic night, and turn instead toward the part of the story that the myth has been obscuring, which is not the story of what was lost, but the story of what survived, and how, and through whose patient and largely unrecorded effort. There is a different kind of accumulation at work in the survival of knowledge. An accumulation of small decisions that runs exactly parallel to the accumulation of small failures that killed the library, and it deserves to be looked at with the same care. Let us go to Constantinople then, to a scriptorium in the 9th century of the Common Era, to see what preservation actually looked like. The monk is sitting at his desk in the early morning, and his breath makes a small cloud in the cold air above the parchment, and he is copying a text that has not been read, so far as he can determine, in 300 years. The text is a mathematical work, written in Greek, and the monk's Greek is adequate but not excellent, which means that he is copying carefully but not always understanding fully what he copies, which is a problem that would trouble subsequent scholars, but that is, in this moment, less important than the act of copying itself, less important than the fact that the parchment he is writing on is dure. able, and that the ink he is using is stable, and that when he finishes this copy it will join other copies in the library of the monastery, where it will be available at some future point that neither he nor anyone he knows can predict, to a scholar who will be able to read it and understand it and do something with it. He is not thinking about the Library of Alexandria. He is not thinking about the history of Greek mathematics. He is thinking about the cold, and about getting the letter forms right, and about the chapter of the rule that he must have memorized by this evening. He is doing something historically significant in a completely routine way, and that's precisely the character of most preservation. The survival of Greek knowledge from the ancient world through the medieval period and into the Renaissance is a story with several overlapping threads, and it is worth separating them before trying to follow any one of them to its conclusion. The Byzantine Empire, the eastern continuation of the Roman Empire centered on Constantinople, maintained a tradition of Greek scholarship throughout the medieval period that served as one crucial thread. Byzantine scholars copied and commented on ancient texts, maintained libraries in monasteries and in the imperial capital, and preserved a continuous tradition of Greek literacy that kept the language and its literature alive through centuries when it had largely disappeared from Western Europe. The texts that survive in Byzantine manuscripts are not all the texts that were in the Library of Alexandria, not by a very large margin, but they include many of the most important ones, preserved through a chain of copying that runs from the ancient world to the medieval without a complete break. The Arab translation movement that began in the 8th century of the Common Era and reached its height under the Abbasid caliphs in Baghdad represents a second thread, and it is in many ways the more dramatic one. The Caliph al-Mansur, who founded Baghdad in the middle of the 8th century, and his successors, particularly Harun al-Rashid and al-Mamun, invested enormous resources in the systematic translation of Greek scientific and philosophical works into Arabic, establishing the House of Wisdom as an institution specifically dedicated to this project, and bringing scholars from across the Islamic world and beyond to participate in it. The translators who worked in Baghdad in the 8th and 9th centuries were doing something that required not just linguistic skill, but deep scholarly understanding, because the texts they were translating were difficult, often technically demanding, written in a tradition of thought and expression that required extensive contextual knowledge to render accurately into a different language with different philosophical assumptions and different mathematical conventions. The most important of these translators was Hunayn ibn Ishaq, a Christian physician who worked in Baghdad in the 9th century and whose mastery of Greek, Syriac, and Arabic made him the most productive and most reliable translator of the generation. Hunayn approached his work with a scholarly rigor that would have been recognizable to the Alexandrian philologists who had first established the principles of textual criticism 1,000 years before him. He collected multiple manuscripts of each text he intended to translate, compared them carefully, identified the variants, and made judgments about which readings were most reliable, and only Han produced his translation. He translated works by Galen and Hippocrates, by Plato and Aristotle, by Euclid and Archimedes, producing Arabic versions of these texts that were more accurate and more complete than anything previously available in that language. His translations became the foundation of Arabic scientific and philosophical learning for centuries, and through Arabic they eventually passed back into Latin, entering the European tradition that would produce the Renaissance. Hunayn left behind a bibliography of his own work, a catalogue of the translations he had made, and the texts he had sought out, and the manuscript sources he had used. That is itself a document of enormous historical significance, because it allows us to trace the transmission history of specific texts with a precision that is normally impossible for this period. He describes searching for manuscripts of Galen's works in Syria and Palestine and Egypt, traveling specifically to find better copies, writing to colleagues in other cities, asking them to look for texts he had not been able to locate himself. This is scholarship conducted as a form of sustained collaborative endeavor, the same principle that had animated the library's original acquisition program 1,000 years before, expressed now not through royal agents boarding ships in a harbor, but through a network of scholarly correspondence spread across the Islamic world. The methods were different. The underlying commitment to gathering the best available evidence before drawing conclusions was continuous. The story of Archimedes' survival is one of the most remarkable individual stories in the history of textual transmission, and it is worth following in some detail because it illustrates, in miniature, the full character of how ancient texts passed through time. Archimedes' mathematical works survived in Byzantine manuscripts through the medieval period, copied and sometimes studied by scholars who could read Greek but who did not always fully grasp the depth of what they were reading. One of these manuscripts, containing works by Archimedes that do not survive in any other form, was taken at some point in the medieval period, and the parchment was scraped clean so that it could be reused for a Christian prayer book. The mathematical text erased and written over with devotional material, the work of one of the most consequential mathematical minds of the ancient world, sacrificed for the practical needs of a medieval monastery. The manuscript that resulted from this scraping, which is technically called palimpsest, survived for centuries in an obscure monastery before being sold and resold and eventually emerging into scholarly attention in the 20th century. Ultraviolet and X-ray imaging technology developed in the 20th and 21st centuries has allowed scholars to read what was scraped away and written over, to recover the Archimedean text from beneath the prayer book, to restore to the historical record mathematical arguments that were within an erasure of complete disappearance. The Archimedes palimpsest, as it is now known, contains the only surviving copy of several Archimedean works, including a treatise on the method that he used to discover his mathematical results, a work that shows him using something very close to integral calculus, 800 years before Newton and Leibniz. It survived because a monk in a medieval monastery needed parchment and scraped the text away, and because that act of erasure was incomplete, and because the incomplete erasure preserved, in the chemical residue of the scraped ink, enough of the original to be recovered by technology that would not exist for another 1,000 years. Let that sit for a moment. The survival of knowledge is sometimes like this. Not the heroic act of rescue, but the accidental, incomplete destruction. Not the foresighted scholar preparing for the future, but the careless monk preparing for a prayer meeting, with the future recovering what the present discarded. The path from the ancient to the modern is rarely the clean transmission that we prefer to imagine. It is more often a series of narrow escapes, a collection of accidents that could have gone differently, a chain of survivals that was not planned and that no one at the time would have recognized as the preservation of something irreplaceable. The Arabic translation movement did not merely preserve the Greek tradition, it extended it, and this is a distinction that the myth of the catastrophic loss tends to obscure. The Islamic scholars who worked with the Greek texts in Baghdad and Cordoba and Cairo were not simply translators. They were mathematicians and astronomers and physicians who used the Greek texts as a foundation for their own original work, who identified the errors and the gaps in the ancient corpus and worked to correct and fill them, who developed algebra and trigonometry and the decimal number system in ways that the Greek tradition had not, and who produced a body of scientific and philosophical work that was, in many respects, more advanced than anything that had come before it. The knowledge that eventually returned to Europe through the translations made from Arabic into Latin in the 12th and 13th centuries was not the same knowledge that had left Alexandria. It was older knowledge, improved, extended, corrected by generations of brilliant minds who had taken it seriously enough to push beyond it. Al-Khwarizmi, working in Baghdad in the 9th century, wrote the treatise on calculation whose title, shortened and Latinized, gives us the word algebra, and whose methods, developed from the Greek and Indian mathematical traditions, established the framework for a whole branch of mathematics that the ancient world had not possessed in systematic form. Ibn al-Haytham, working in Cairo in the 11th century, produced an account of optics and the psychology of visual perception that was more complete and more accurate than anything Euclid or Ptolemy had written on the subject, building on the Greek foundation but extending it decisively. These works are not footnotes to the Alexandrian story. They are the next chapters, the continuation of a project of accumulated understanding that the library had begun and that continued through multiple custodians and multiple languages and multiple political contexts. Long after the library itself had ceased to exist, the question of what was actually lost, as distinct from what was preserved and extended, is one that historians approach with considerable care because the answer is genuinely difficult to specify. We know that texts existed that do not survive, because they are cited in other texts that do survive, and the citations give us the title and sometimes a description of the argument or the content. We know that Aristotle wrote several dialogues in the Platonic style that were admired in antiquity and that survive only in fragments. We know that there were historians and poets and philosophers whose work was read and discussed by people whose own work does survive and whose texts have simply not come down to us. We do not know how much of this loss was directly attributable to the decline of the Alexandrian library, as opposed to the normal processes of textual attrition by which texts that are not actively copied eventually disappear. And the question of attribution is, in some ways, the wrong question, because the normal processes of textual attrition and the decline of the library were not separate phenomena, but aspects of the same larger process. Consider what the citations alone can tell us. Galen, the Roman physician of the 2nd century of the Common Era, cites hundreds of earlier medical writers whose work no longer survives in any form. Writers who clearly had things to say about anatomy and pharmacology and the treatment of disease that Galen found worth engaging with and arguing against. Writers who had developed positions complex enough that Galen needed to explain and refute them at length. We have Galen's account of what they argued, but not their own words, and the difference between an account and the original is always significant, because Galen had reasons to characterize his predecessors in particular ways, and the characterization, however fair, is not the same thing as the primary source. The same is true in mathematics, where texts by Heron of Alexandria, Antiofantus, and a dozen other ancient mathematicians survive only partially, and where the portions that survive are sometimes clearly excerpted from larger works whose full extent we can only guess at from the surviving fragments. What we can say with reasonable confidence is that the most significant losses were probably not the most famous ones. The texts we grieve most readily are the ones we know about: the lost plays of Sophocles, the lost dialogues of Aristotle, the works of Hypatia, because they were famous enough in antiquity for their loss to have been recorded and noticed. But the texts whose loss may have been more consequential are the ones we cannot even name. The technical manuals and the geographical surveys and the natural historical observations and the medical case records that formed the practical infrastructure of ancient knowledge and that were never famous enough to be mentioned in the texts that survived, and whose disappearance has left gaps in our a standing of the ancient world that we cannot even clearly identify because we do not know what we are missing. There was a vast body of practical knowledge in the ancient world, knowledge about agriculture and construction and navigation and metallurgy and the organization of large-scale economic activity, and the survival of this knowledge was always more dependent on continuing practice than on textual transmission, which means that much of it was lost, not in the library, but in the disruption of the practical traditions that embodied it. The story of preservation is also, in its way, a story about the accumulation of small decisions, and it runs exactly parallel to the story of the library's decline that we have been following through these sections. Not the single heroic act of saving a library, not the single foresighted scholar who understood what was at stake and made a plan to protect it, but the repeated, unremarkable, unglamorous choice of one person after another to copy one more text, to carry one more scroll from a burning building, to find one more reason to believe that the words were worth keeping, even though the world outside the scriptorium was not particularly interested in whether they were kept. The survival of ancient knowledge is a story about the same human capacity for patient, incremental, collectively significant work that the library itself represented at its best. A story about what happens when enough people care enough over a long enough period to do the small and unspectacular things that add up, in the end, to something that matters enormously. The story of preservation is, in the end, the same story as the story of loss, run in a different direction. And we have followed both long enough now that we can let the narrative rest and return to the place where it began. Alexandria is still there. The harbor is still there. We can go back to it, to the pre-dawn light and the salt air and the limestone streets that the Ptolemies laid out in the 3rd century before the Common Era, when a young conqueror's successors decided that this strip of Egyptian coast would become the intellectual capital of the world. We go back now, carrying everything we have learned, to see what remains. The harbor is still there, the same curve of coast where the ships once arrived carrying scrolls that would be taken and copied before they were returned. The same flat Mediterranean light that would have fallen across the reading rooms in the mornings when the scholars came to work. The lighthouse is gone, collapsed into the sea in a medieval earthquake, and the library is gone too, or rather it is everywhere and nowhere, present in every library that has ever tried to hold more than one person's reading and absent from the specific address it once occupied. The building itself so thoroughly vanished that archaeologists still argue about exactly where it stood. The city of Alexandria today is a metropolis of several million people, Egypt's second city, a port and a commercial hub and a place of considerable ordinary life, markets and traffic and apartment blocks, and the particular quality of Mediterranean light that falls on all of it equally, on the fishing boats in the harbor and the ruins of the old city walls and the site where the royal quarter Ankh-e stood, now overlaid with centuries of subsequent building. The stones of Ptolemy's palace buried somewhere beneath the foundations of everything that came after. There is a new library, the Bibliotheca Alexandrina, opened in the early years of the 21st century, built close to where the ancient institution may have stood, designed to gesture toward the original through its scale and its ambition and its explicit commitment to being a place where knowledge is gathered and made accessible. It's a serious institution with serious collections. It's also inevitably a monument to absence, a building whose meaning depends on what is not there, rather than on what is. A tribute to an institution that can be commemorated but not restored. The Bibliotheca Alexandrina is not the library. It could not be the library because the library was not a building but a project, and the project was specific to a moment in history when a particular dynasty with a particular set of ambitions decided to concentrate the resources of a wealthy empire on a single institutional goal, and that moment has passed and cannot be recovered. What the new library can do, and what it does, is continue the practice that the library originated, the practice of gathering knowledge from multiple traditions and making it available to those who want to use it, the practice of treating the preservation and organization of human understanding as a public good worth paying for. Whether it does this well or badly is a question that the library's own history suggests we should not assume will answer itself in the direction of success. Institutions require sustained commitment. Sustained commitment requires people in positions of power who believe that the commitment is worth making. That belief is not permanent, and it does not maintain itself. What we mourn when we mourn the Library of Alexandria is not entirely what we think we mourn. We are not when we grieve the fire that did not happen, or the decree that was probably invented, grieving the specific texts that were lost, most of which we cannot name. We are grieving the idea of the place, the institution as it exists in imagination, the library that held everything, and whose loss was therefore the loss of everything. The clean and total catastrophe that explains at a stroke why we do not know more than we know, why the ancient world's understanding of mathematics and medicine and astronomy was so much more advanced than what came after it in missing any places, and for many centuries, why there's a gap in the history of human knowledge that no one has quite satisfactorily explained. The library that we mourn is a myth, and the myth is doing real emotional work. And the work it is doing is not entirely without value, because the desire to believe that knowledge was once gathered and complete and then destroyed by someone else's barbarity is also a way of expressing the wish that it could be gathered and made complete again, that the loss is not permanent, that the fire can be undone. The fire cannot be undone. There was, in any case, no fire. There was instead 6 centuries of accumulated small decisions, the kind of decisions that do not feel like decisions at the time, that feel instead like adjustments and temporary measures and reasonable responses to immediate pressures. The Ptolemy, who did not appoint a new head librarian right away. The Roman emperor, who redirected the Mouseions budget toward a military campaign. The bishop, who found the Serapeum's location more useful as a church than as a library. The administrators, who let the acquisitions program lapse, because there were more pressing things to spend money on. None of them believed they were destroying the library. None of them were. They were each making a decision that was defensible in isolation, and that was, in isolation, not quite fatal. The fatality was collective and cumulative and slow. Alexandria has been mourning the library for longer than the library existed. This is a strange fact that is worth sitting with. The institution operated, from its founding to its effective end as an organized scholarly community, for something in the region of 6 centuries. Alexandria has been commemorating and lamenting and constructing narratives about the library's destruction for more than 2,000 years, which is to say that the library has been lost for 3 times as long as it was present, and that the loss has generated more cultural production than the institution itself did, or at least more cultural production that has reached us, which may be the Samar, a thing. The myth has outlasted the reality by so great a margin that they are no longer in any meaningful competition. The myth has won. The myth is the library now, for most of the people who know the library at all. There is something worth examining in the fact that the myth always takes the same shape. Whatever the specific villain and whatever the specific moment of destruction, the library is always complete before it burns. It is always the repository of everything human beings knew up to that point, everything about medicine and astronomy and mathematics and philosophy and literature and the natural world, gathered in one place, available to anyone who could read. The sum of accumulated understanding, waiting to be used, and then it burns, or it is destroyed, or it is decreed out of existence, and the completeness is lost. And the gap that results explains everything that came after, explains all the things we do not know and cannot recover, explains the long centuries of what is sometimes called the Dark Ages, when the lights went out because someone put them out. The truth is that the lights were never all in one building, and the building never contained everything, and what it contained was copied and scattered long before it was lost, and what was lost was a fraction of what was copied, and what was not copied was already beginning to be recovered through the patient work of scholars working in traditions that the library had influenced without control. The truth is distributed and complicated and does not make a good story. The myth is concentrated and simple and makes an excellent story, and the myth, being an excellent story, keeps getting told, keeps getting adapted to new contexts, keeps finding new villains to assign the destruction to, because each age needs the story, needs it to make sense of what it has lost, and to find somewhere to direct its grief. The city of Alexandria today is a place that knows what it is supposed to be, what the world expects of it, what weight the name carries to the people who arrive there, having read about the library and looking for some trace of it. There is not much to find in the physical landscape of the modern city. The coastline has changed through 2,000 years of earthquake and subsidence. Buildings and harbor walls that were on dry ground in the Ptolemaic period, now lying beneath several meters of seawater. Archaeologists diving in the eastern harbor have found fragments of what may be structures from the Ptolemaic era, column drums and blocks of stone, the scattered evidence of buildings that collapsed into the sea over the centuries, and that are being studied, patient meter by patient meter, in conditions that make the work slow and the results provisional. There is no sign that says this is where the library stood, because nobody knows exactly where the library stood, and the building itself has left no trace that has been conclusively identified. It was made of stone, and stone was reused, and what the stone was used for subsequently is also largely unknown. The absence is productive, in its way, into the space where the library stood and where the library's destruction can be precisely located. Each age inserts its own version of the story, its own understanding of what was lost and who caused the loss and what the loss means. The ancient world inserted Caesar. The medieval world inserted the Caliph Omar. The modern world has tended to insert a more diffuse villain. The general forces of religious intolerance or political indifference, or the failure of civilizations to protect what they most need. Because the modern world is sophisticated enough to know that individual villains are usually cover stories for systemic failures, we continue to look for the person responsible. The library's history insists that there was no person responsible, or rather that there were too many people responsible, distributed across too many decades for responsibility to attach to any of them in a way that feels satisfying. We do not know exactly what we lost. We know we lost something. We know that the tradition of systematic scholarly inquiry that the library embodied was interrupted in Alexandria, was made more dangerous, was dispersed into other institutions in other cities where it continued and developed in ways that the library's existence had made possible. We know that some texts disappeared in ways that were probably connected to the library's decline. We do not know what those texts contained. We know they existed because other texts refer to them. We do not know and cannot know what difference their survival would have made. The persistence of the myth is worth one more consideration before the harbor and the early light call us back. Every generation since the ancient world has found a way to tell the story of the library's destruction that suited its own anxieties and its own understanding of where civilization was threatened. The Renaissance humanists, who lamented the loss of ancient texts, used the library's destruction to explain what they were trying to recover. The Enlightenment thinkers who made the story of Caesar's fire canonical were also writing about the dangers of religious authority suppressing rational inquiry. The 19th century scholars who popularized the story of the Christian mobs and the murder of Hypatia were writing about the relationship between science and faith in their own moment, as much as they were writing about late antique Alexandria. And the 20th century science writers who made the story of the library's destruction a symbol of human barbarism were writing about what they feared their own century was capable of, which turned out to be a reasonable thing to fear. The library functions as a mirror. Whatever we fear losing, whatever we believe is most at risk, whatever destruction we most need to find an explanation for, the library provides the occasion for it. It's an infinitely adaptable symbol, precise enough to feel specific and vague enough to mean almost anything. It has survived its own destruction by becoming something far more durable than a collection of scrolls, an idea about what knowledge means and what its loss costs. An idea that every age can fill with its own content and its own grief. We are not better at this than they were. That is the thing that the library's history, honestly examined, keeps insisting on. The institutions that matter to us now depend on exactly the same kind of sustained commitment that the library depended on, are vulnerable to exactly the same kinds of erosion, are already, somewhere in the world, experiencing the early stages of exactly the same kind of decline that the library experienced in the middle years of the 2nd century before the Common Era, when nobody noticed, when it would have been very easy to notice if anyone had been paying attention to the right things. The lesson is not comfortable, and it does not resolve into a tidy warning. It resolves instead into a question, which is the question that the library's whole history has been asking. Who is paying attention? And what do they believe is worth maintaining? And for how long? The city goes about its business. It has always gone about its business. It has always gone about its business. Alexandria was never only a library, never only the intellectual project that the Ptolemies built there. It was also a port and a market and a place where people lived and worked and argued and prayed and died, where ordinary life went on in all its density and particularity, largely indifferent to whether the scholars in the Mouseion were producing important mathematics. The people of Alexandria in the 3rd century before the Common Era didn't, for the most part, use the library. It was not that kind of institution. It was an institution for scholars, funded by kings, producing work that most of the city's inhabitants would never encounter and wouldn't have been able to use even if they had. And yet the library mattered, and the city knew it mattered, in the way that a city knows that certain things happening within its boundaries define something about what kind of city it is. Give it a character and a weight in the world that goes beyond the purely economic or the purely political. Alexandria was where the library was. That fact shaped how the city was perceived by the wider Greek-speaking world, shaped who came to it and what they brought with them, shaped the quality of the intellectual life that was possible within its walls. When the library declined, the city didn't immediately become less significant, but something about its character shifted, and the shift was not reversible. What remains in the silence where the library was is also something, and it's worth naming before leaving the harbor and the early light. What remains is the fact of the project, the fact that human beings once decided in a specific time and place that gathering and organizing and making available the whole of human knowledge was worth doing, was worth the considerable expense and difficulty involved, was worth the sustained attention of a political dynasty across 3 generations. That decision was made once, here, in this city, and the institution that resulted from it shaped the history of human knowledge in ways that are still unfolding. The Alexandrian scholars didn't write in isolation. They wrote in a tradition, and the tradition continued through the copies and the translations and the extensions and the corrections, through the House of Wisdom in Baghdad and the monasteries of Constantinople and the universities of medieval Europe, through the printing press and the library science that emerged from it and the digital systems that are now extending it further. The Alexandrian project is not over. It is ongoing, distributed, imperfect, underfunded, politically contested, and continuous. The morning is coming, not the morning in the 2nd century before the Common Era, when the scholars were beginning to make their way through the cool streets toward the reading rooms, but a morning in the present, in a city that has had many mornings since then, that has been conquered and reconquered and rebuilt and modernized, and that carries its famous history as a burden and a resource in roughly equal measure. The sun comes up over the Mediterranean, the same way it always has. The light arriving from the east and finding the surface of the harbor and the facades of the buildings along the waterfront and the site where the library stood, which is now other things, which has been other things for longer than the library itself existed. There is no reading room. There are no scroll cases. There is no scholar working through a difficult text in the early morning. No lamp to light, no catalogue to consult. The building is gone. The catalogue is gone. Most of the scrolls are gone, passed through so many hands and so many languages, that they exist now in forms their original copyists would not recognize. And some of them are genuinely gone, irrecoverable. A silence in the record that no technology will fill. The silence is real. It is not as large as the myth requires. We know more from the ancient world than the story of the catastrophic fire allows, and the knowledge we have was preserved by a chain of human effort that stretches from the scholars of the Mouseion through the Byzantine monasteries, through the translation houses of Baghdad, to the libraries of Europe and the universities of the modern world. The chain is continuous, it is fragile, and it has been broken in places and patiently repaired again across the centuries, and it is continuous. The Mediterranean, the early light, the harbor, the city going about its morning. Something that mattered was here. Something of it remains. The morning does not know that. The morning arrives regardless, indifferent to what was built on this shore, and what was lost, and what survived, and what is still being carried forward, in libraries and in universities, and in the practices of people who believe, against the odds and against the general tendency of political will, that gathering and preserving and making accessible the whole of human knowledge is a project worth sustaining. The morning arrives. The city stirs. The light finds the surface of the harbor and moves across it in the way that light has always moved across water, as if time were not passing at all, as if the 3rd century before the Common Era and this particular morning were not separated by anything that the light could measure or notice. In the light, everything is present at once: the Ptolemies and their scholars, the ships in the harbor and the agents on the dock, the scroll cases in the reading rooms, the monk in Constantinople and his cold breath above the parchment, the translators in Baghdad and their patient Arabic renderings of Greek mathematics, all of it present in the light, all of it resting on the same water, all of it part of the same long story that has no ending because the project it describes is not finished. The scrolls are still there, in a sense, not the originals, not the papyrus that the Ptolemaic agents pulled from the ships in the harbor and set their copyists to work on, but the words themselves, the arguments and the measurements and the proofs and the poems passed from hand to hand across 23 centuries, copied onto new surfaces by people who mostly had no idea they were doing something historically significant, who were simply doing what people who care about words do, which is to write them down again before they disappear. Euclid is still there. You can read him today in an edition whose text traces back through a chain of copyists to a manuscript made in Constantinople in the 9th century, from an earlier copy still, the words moving through time in the way that rivers move through landscapes, changing their course, losing some water and gaining other water, but remaining recognizably the same river. Eratosthenes' measurement of the Earth was wrong by only a few hundred kilometers. Aristarchus' suggestion that the Earth moved around the Sun waited 17 centuries for someone to confirm it. Hypatia's specific mathematical work did not survive, but the tradition she represented did, passing through the scholars who had studied with her and the scholars who had studied with them, thinning and thinning again across the centuries, but not stopping. The library is gone. The knowledge is mostly here. The story we tell about the fire is the story we need, the story that makes loss dramatic and responsibility clear and civilization fragile in a way that feels like a warning rather than a process. The warning is real, but the process is what actually happened. Libraries die slowly. They die from indifference and underfunding and the gradual failure of the people in power to believe that the preservation of knowledge is worth what it costs. They die in ways that nobody, at the time, recognizes as dying, because each individual decision that contributes to the death seems small and defensible, and not quite fatal. The scrolls are still. The harbor is still. Somewhere in the dark, the lighthouse would be turning, if the lighthouse was still there. Thank you for spending this evening here, in the ruins of the most famous library in the world. If this is the kind of company you come here for at night, subscribing to the channel means the next story will be waiting for you whenever you are ready. There is always another lost thing, another long and careful truth underneath a simpler story, another reason to stay a little longer in the dark. Sleep well.